I think the most important things that brands can do is actually find ways to directly connect to young people, be that through music events, be that through subcultures, be that through inviting them to create with the brands, be that through creating third spaces that they can exist in. So I think if you can be smart and start to build the outreach now, you're going to have really substantial brand loyalty because there's so few brands who are actually reaching out to them directly.
That is Paula James Martinez, editor-in-chief and founder of Cookie Magazine. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Create Tomorrow podcast. I'm your host, Cassandra Napoli, head of consumer forecasting at WGSN. Every 2 weeks, I will take you on a journey to examine how trends are translated into aesthetics and product design. Adolescence has always been a stage where youth are supposed to experiment with identity, style, values, friendships, aspirations. But what happens when those spaces designed for that experimentation disappear? In this episode, Paula and I discuss how social media, age compression, and the decline of teen-focused spaces are reshaping adolescence and what it would take to build better spaces for the next gen. Welcome to the Create Tomorrow podcast, Paula. I'm so excited for this conversation. Can you, just to start, introduce yourself and share a little bit about who you are, what you do, and a bit about your new project, Cookie?
I'm Paula James Martinez. I am British originally, but I now live in Asheville, North Carolina. And I am the founder and editor-in-chief of a new print teen magazine called Cookie.
And what is Cookie, and why did you launch it?
I started in magazines when I was 19 at Dazed and Confused, and I've kind of been through every facet of media life. When I started at Dazed, they let me do the website because no one else wanted to do it, and it was just like the weird thing for the kids, and now it's become everything. And I think it's kind of like going through that journey. Everyone in media sees the shifts. And I don't think we necessarily know exactly where this next shift is going, but I think we can all see that the status quo is changing. But on another level, I'm also the mom of a 9-year-old daughter. And I got to the point last year where Teen Vogue folded into Vogue. And I was like, that's kind of, to me, the last bastion, the last death of teen media. Where is my daughter going to go for her culture? And I'm trying to keep her off TikTok. And, as we know, the teen social media ban just was introduced in the UK yesterday. And I realized there was this huge void in terms of there was absolutely nowhere for them to go apart from social media at this point. They don't have MTV. They don't have the radio. They barely have malls at this point to hang out in. Like, what do we have for teenagers? So I post on Threads, which I'd barely ever used before, saying, I'm fashion director of ex-fashion director of Refinery 29. I have a tween daughter. Shall I bring back teen print? And within a day, 15,000 people had liked it. And then I had 3,000 comments. And so I put my email on there because it seemed like this is actually going to be a thing. Within a week, I had 3,000 emails from everyone from moms to middle school teachers to teens themselves to brands to old editor friends, including some of the staff of Teen Vogue, New York Times editors, all sorts of people. And so we kind of accidentally started Cookie. It was very much like building the plane as we fly, in the sense of I had a whole editorial staff before we even had a name. Which is not your normal way to start a company. But at the same time, I think it just shows like the cultural appetite and kind of void that was there already.
If a girl who loved, those institutions in 2008 when she was 13, right? So Teen Vogue, Delia's going to the mall, etc. Where do you think she does go today to figure out who she is? Is it just online?
I think so. But what's interesting is there's also we've broken them into two demographics. We're almost like we have, if you take the camp analogy, like the camp counselors who are the slightly older girls who have been online, and a lot of them have experienced really kind of horrific things online. They don't particularly like that space. A lot of the 17-year-olds that we talk to on our editorial board are saying everything online is to just tell me why there's something wrong with me and then sell it back to me in a different way. They don't feel like their culture's necessarily seen there, or there's actually a real social connection there anymore, which I think is different to the beginning of social media. It's a different world out there now. And then the other group is really interesting. We're calling them, they're more like the campers. They're like the bubble kids. They're from maybe ages like 11 to 14. I spoke to one girl in New York who it's not allowed a smartphone or social media, and she likened it to being the Cold War Russia for her lack of information from the outside world. She's like, there's absolutely nowhere for me to get information. She said, maybe a couple of websites, but really she doesn't have any contact with outside culture beyond the radio her mom listens to or Spotify.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's wild to think about that. If you look at some of the social media bans that are in place, so Australia really kicked it off last December, and they've actually rolled out YouTube as well. So YouTube is considered banned. But YouTube is such a space for learning and growth. And, I think the internet as a whole is a double-edged sword, right? It could be a positive experience, but it could also be a negative one. A lot of countries have followed suit. Most recently, as you mentioned, as of yesterday, we're recording this in June. And as of yesterday, the UK has proposed a ban for under 16. Do you think that's the answer?
It's been interesting because I had a lot of debate with people yesterday, and I think bans are a very blunt instrument, but they cause people to think about things in a different way, in the same way as, cigarettes are not allowed under a certain age, or alcohol is not allowed under a certain age. I think it's a line in the sand that says these things are addictive and that we should probably be thinking about them in a different way.
If you turn off social spaces for young people, how does a brand who's invested in digital media for the last 10 years, how do they reach, the tweens, the Gen Alpha, the Gen Zalpha, as we call them?
It's been interesting. Even, we don't even have our first copy out the door yet, and we've already been in like rooms, I would say, with about 12 Fortune 500 companies, which doesn't usually happen at this stage of especially a print media startup. But I think it speaks to that exact thing. And I think the future is experiential. And I think it's community building in a slightly different way. I think more and more brands are realizing the value of owning their own community, even if you look at Substack and things like that, that you just can't rely on someone else being the wall or the gate between the access of you and the customer. It's a really precarious place to be. And so I think this kind of novel way of now building community, with Cookie, we're going to be a subscription-based model, but as part of the subscription, every teen who joins gets a Cookie Club card. They become a member of a club. They get podcasts, and they get like MTV style radio shows through it, and they get new access points, but they also get discounts to go and see movies on like a Tuesday. They also get discounts to go get ice cream. They also have events. We're going to do like a touring band series. So I think for us, it's about how, for me, print is the door to a whole world. And I think that's how brands need to start thinking about themselves as well, is like they're creating these experiential worlds. And we've given up on malls in recent years, but I actually think in-person retail is going to become more and more vital for brands.
Yeah, we've been forecasting that for a while. The return of the mall rat, actually, because a lot of the young kids we talk to actually want to go back to the mall and spend time there and poke around. And so when you have no teen institutions in these spaces, that becomes detrimental to winning their spend. And also just, you're a mom of a 9-year-old. I'm sure you can attest to this, but all of the data that we see says that, your Gen Alpha kid is actually controlling your wallet, right? Like they are directing how you spend your money as a millennial parent or a Gen X parent. And so there is really great power in winning them over.
Think, that's what we have been saying. It's a window to a generation. And I hate to be that soft millennial parent who has her daughter controlling her wallet, but it's true. And I started studying, all the data too, as we were bringing this up, and with a lot of other millennial parents who are also on the team. And I was like, you know what? I wouldn't go on vacation or I wouldn't go on holiday somewhere that she said no to. And I would not buy her a shirt that she said no to. And I probably would not send her to a camp that she said no to. There's a different level, I think, of our respect for autonomy. And that's why it's a very odd place, I think, for kids now, because on one hand, we're listening to them a lot, but then we're also giving them almost no real freedom, and I think that to me is what the mall provides. And it's even interesting. I think Claire's is going to be really interesting to look at. They're coming back, they're rebranding. I think they're thinking of themselves much more in that third space. I think the success of Starbucks, or the success that Starbucks didn't really want, of becoming almost the only third space for teen girls. I think it's interesting because I live in North Carolina now, but I used to live in LA, and I lived in LA for 10 years. And LA actually has very, very successful malls. But they really kind of invested in those malls being spaces that you want to be present in and you want to hang out in, and that they have more than just kind of shopping. It's funny when you say Mallrats, because we actually have a column, our shopping pages are called Mallrats. And it's encouraging girls that being a Mallrat is kind of punk, because it's actually going to the mall. The act of going to the mall is the act of hanging out with your friends and not necessarily even having to buy anything. It's being present, it's seeing the trends, it's being there. And yeah, every third time you're going to buy something, but actually going to the mall inherently is like a social hang as opposed to just a capitalist experience. And I think that's also going to be interesting with Gen Alpha. They're more and more turned off by online shopping, and they're more and more turned off by the internet. My 9-year-old asked me the other day if Moana was AI, and I was like, no, that's animation. But they do use AI as a derogatory term amongst each other in the playground. They'll be like, that's so AI, as in that's sus and that's fake and you're being AI. And so I think as that merges with influencer culture and online shopping, it's going to be interesting to see the trust level of that generation who's now starting to not trust anything unless they physically see it in their hands.
How do we create those environments that help young people really enjoy being the age that they are without constantly trying to age out of that era?
The reason that age compression is happening outwardly is because there's nowhere else for them to see themselves as cool. What they see as cool is a 24-year-old young woman, because they don't see teens, not real teens, reflected back at them. And they don't have their own spaces to express themselves in novel ways. And they are really expressive and they are really excited. And, it's interesting, even we're like building up the music side of Cookie, because we're going to do Cookie Radio and we're going to have teens like interview young artists, because we realize there's no places for them for discovery for them, and for them to go face to face with young artists. And even Amplified summer camp we're working at, they opened a thing called Campcella, where they allowed young artists to send in their bands. And some of these artists were incredible and like so unique and so bizarre. And I was like, there's all these girls and like boys out there making stuff in their bedrooms, and they maybe don't have TikTok, so no one's actually ever heard of them, but they're like incredibly cool. And when the other teens see them, they're all in awe of them, and they have that movement. It's just, I don't know where we're not providing the space for them to find that.
Yeah, it seems like things sort of go full circle, right? In like the trend world, that's true. So we're sort of returning to a pre-internet era, maybe, where there's, showcases and things like that instead of discovering on the internet.
I think that lack of organic community has been a really interesting shift. And I think that is why young people are driving analog so aggressively. But on the flip side, they're also driving things like Cyberdex. We have a whole feature on Cyberdex, which is, young people building their own kind of like single use computers or single like task computers. And I spoke to a lot of like young women, particularly about why they were doing this. And they said because they want to be decentralized from the system. Like it's punk to them to make a tiny computer that just takes notes or a tiny computer that just plays music and put it inside a Polly Pocket and having done it themselves. It's their way of breaking away from this kind of world that they feel is so homogenized and not really built for them.
I want to take a minute and just explore Cookie a little bit more. So, on the day of launch, if I'm a subscriber, what would I get? What would my experience look like?
So our earliest subscribers are about to get our journal annual that goes to print in about a week. And the idea with the annual was every year it's like a hardback annual that you keep. And the first one's called the universe, and the front half is our universe, and the back half is their universe. So it gives them space to junk journal and create their memories. And the reason I wanted to have these annuals is because so many teens were telling me they don't have any artifacts or like memories, like physical memories of things, because everything's online. So this would allow them, say you start in middle school, you would then have, you know, kind of these amazing artifacts by the time you've reached college of all these different years of your existence. And you could look back and go, oh, it's like a yearbook of my life almost. But at the same time, it provides this kind of editorial container for Cookie. So that's launching in 2 weeks, I believe, depending on my printers, and going out into the world. We're then going to summer camp to do residency, and then soft launching out the back of that. Everyone who's an early subscriber to the monthly issue will get access to their Cookie Club membership, which will give them podcasts and discounts through the summer and special surprises like arriving in the mail. And then from January, every single month, you will get an issue of Cookie magazine, but each one will kind of access its own universe. So like I said, it's a door. So if our issue is about the great outdoors, like our touch grass issue, it will also have access to hiking clubs near you and trails, and maybe we'll do like documentary screenings about the environment. Or our beauty issue will come with skincare, but it's been approved by our editors as like an unboxing experience, and perhaps we'll have like podcasts that talk about like young skin with real dermatologists. Everything in Cookie is like, it should feel like a special moment. It comes from my own 9-year-old being so obsessed. We now live in rural North Carolina, and we get a tiny little local newspaper that basically tells us about farmers markets and the pigs and the local library. But she reads it cover to cover because it's the only thing she gets through the door that she counts as hers. Otherwise, it's just bills for us. And I think there's something really, really novel for young people, for something that comes and surprises.
That tactility too, I think, is so important for Gen Alpha. I mean, we didn't really touch on this, but these are kids that were young during COVID, that impacted their early life. So tactility and sensorial, experiences are something we're tracking quite a bit in the trend world. I want to talk about what brands can do now. So what should they be focusing on if they want to generally support young people today?
I think they should be focusing on where are young people and what do young people need? Because I think what these social media bans, or everything that we've discussed really, is opening up is this huge void. So if you want to kind of excel or win the trust of young people, you should show up in the places that young people need. Are you able to create opportunities for third spaces? Are you able to create meetups? Are you able to show movies? Are you able to turn your store into a place that feels welcoming in real life? Are you able to send them something in the mail? Are you able to start a community that supports them that isn't social media because they are looking for like other online ways to connect with each other? Are you able to basically make safe spaces that they feel are inclusive to them? And also, are you able to talk to them? I think the biggest thing I've heard from teenagers is no one ever actually asks us, and I think they're so intelligent, probably more so than we were at that age, because there's so much access to information. Like you said, that kind of like compression of aging in that regard. They're very aware of everything that's happening in the world, and they're very aware of brands kind of pretending to understand them or selling them nostalgia. And they do have nostalgia, but they want to say, we have nostalgia for something we never had, and these are the reasons why we would like you to create these things for us. And it's slightly different to us going, just watch this old movie, you know? And so to me, I think the most important things that brands can do is actually find ways to directly connect to young people, be that through music events, be that through subcultures, be that through inviting them to create with the brands, be that through creating third spaces that they can exist in. I think just looking at them as vessels to sell through on TikTok will work to an extent, but they're becoming more savvy by the second, and they're becoming more bored by the second. And eventually you're just going to disappear in this sea of boredom, or be turned off completely because it's not allowed in that country anyway, you know? So I think if you can be smart and start to build the outreach now, you're going to have really substantial brand loyalty because there's so few brands who are actually reaching out to them directly.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about nostalgia not necessarily being a strategy. Blanketing nostalgia, whatever we liked when we were young and just giving it to the next generation isn't going to work because it's not tailored to them. And so what you were saying, that nostalgia for a time they never experienced, which is interesting, but make it tailored to them. There's a word for that. It's anemoia. It's nostalgia for a time you've never actually had. We saw that a lot with Gen Z when they were kind of coming of age, and now we see it with Gen Alpha, but they're much more discerning. They're much more aware. And so they want those experiences and those stories tailored to them and to modern times. And they don't just want blanket sort of offerings or marketing messages or blanket worlds that worked for other generations, which I think is really confirming to hear, as I talk about this every day. So it's great that you're kind of in cahoots with me on that. Are there any brands that are creating meaningful cultural moments now? So from a retailer, from a young brand perspective, any standouts that come to mind that really get Gen Alpha right now?
It's going to sound like a really weird brand, but Phase-Its. They're the glittery freckles for adults who have not worn them. They've barely done any actual advertising. They've only worked through organic marketing, and they've really kind of drilled deep into culture. They just did like Phase-It colors for the World Cup, and their whole thing is about fun, and they're supporting young athletes, but athletes in a real way, that they're actually talking to the young athletes and going, what are your colors? What's the culture like in the US? There's a big softball culture for young women especially, and they dress up and they do their own stripes and they do their own colors and they put like beads, and they're leaning into these subcultures and meeting these fans where they are. And they kind of did the same through how they showed up at Coachella, and they showed up in like a very like, here, just have these, like gifting type of way, and a very like real way with their fans. I mean, I think obviously we see the Gap on a major scale has really like 180'd it in terms of being very, very kind of dry and fuddy-duddy back to being kind of the epitome of culture. And it's going to be interesting if they can keep that, and how much of that culture actually shows up for Gen Alpha as opposed to older Gen Z, which is also, I think, another dichotomy that people aren't understanding, because everyone is saying Gen Z when they think of teens. But to your point, the oldest Gen Alphas are 16 now, and they're a very different generation to the oldest Gen Zs who are having children of their own, So I think it's hard when you say there's a lot of brands doing it really well for Gen Alpha, because there aren't necessarily. There's, like the weirdest things like squishy butter. Like I was like, I don't even know how these underground phenomena, they're almost like school playground type phenomena with brands, because they want to have something so desperately of their own. They're creating these tiny movements. But there's so few brands speaking directly to Gen Alpha. I think there are brands that are currently shifting their strategies. Like I said, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what Claire's does. I think, even brands like Disney are going to start investing in more content for that young adult audience. It's going to be really interesting to see what they do. But those haven't launched yet. So I'll be watching. But I think it's really important that we don't kind of think what we're doing for Gen Z is actually what's working for teen culture, because I think we look at a lot of the brands that are thriving with Gen Z and doing it really, really well, but they're not really even teens anymore.
We call that the generational changing of the guard, because so many times I have conversations with clients and they're like, we want to, target young people. I'm like, well, Gen Z is still young, but they're very much in a different life stage than true teens. I think that's where that compression of generations comes into play, though. Like, the generations will inevitably get smaller because of how fast culture is moving. So I'm really interested in Zalphas, that fringe group right now between Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who are on the cusp of maybe young adulthood, entering into their late teens and 20s. And the world just looks vastly different than when true Gen Zs, like core Gen Zs, were entering the world. So yeah, it's definitely a real big challenge to kind of get people to think about the youth as Gen Alpha. As always, I ask all of my guests to share someone who they believe is creating a new version of tomorrow. Could be somebody in your own life, could be a famous person, could be a brand. So I want to know, who is your pick?
That's a really interesting question. I would love to call out things like PBS Young Reporters, actually. And I think, PBS has obviously had a rough time recently, but it's really important that there are these organizations that are supporting young people's voices in a time where they feel less heard than ever. And I want to champion them because we've worked with them and they're working tirelessly in 300 high schools across the United States to teach young people how to be journalists, to how to really have a voice, and how that they're important. And so to me, that's the version of tomorrow that I want to be championing, is like creating spaces for young people to actually feel like they're heard and that they're important.
Thank you to my guest, Paula James Martinez, editor-in-chief and founder of Cookie Magazine. If you're a WGSN subscriber, look out for more trends at WGSN.com. And if you're not a subscriber, please come and discover our services. We'll be back with our next episode soon, but in the meantime, you can catch the CEO of WGSN, Carlo Buzzaschi, next week on our other podcast, Lives of Tomorrow. I'm your host, Cassandra Napoli. Be sure to follow and subscribe to this podcast, and see you next time.